This lecture addresses the topics of natural law ethics, virtue ethics, and divine command ethics. These are three additional ethical theories. We've already covered Kantian ethics and we've covered utilitarian ethics. Now we're moving toward, we're moving into natural law, divine command ethics, and virtue ethics. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint slide for you. All right, so we're continuing our discussion of ethical theories. And so the first theory we're going to talk about is natural law ethics. I discussed a few lectures ago in summary the topic of natural law ethics. Natural law ethics essentially forms the basis for the moral philosophy of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, or the Catholic Church. But it's a major theory and must be addressed. There are religious versions of the theory and there are secular versions of the theory. But we're going to focus upon Aquinas once again, as we did a couple of weeks ago, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth and try to provide a little more clarity with regard to natural law ethics. So on the screen before you, or on the slide in front of you, the advocate for natural law ethics was Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas lived in 1200 AD. I think he died in 1274 AD. Thomas Aquinas is the leading theologian slash moral philosopher of the Roman Catholic Church. Most of the moral philosophy, or the ethics of the Catholic Church, is driven by the writings and the theory and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. It is presented in his writing entitled Summa Theologica. Some individuals write it Summa Theologia. He had a number of works, but this is his primary work, and it's his summary of theology, as the Latin words indicate. What is natural law theory? I've given you a definition there with some subpoints that you need to make note of. Natural law ethics says we should construct our morality from the laws of nature. Aquinas said that just as there are physical laws in the physical universe, like let's just take, for example, the law of gravity. The law of gravity. If you violate the law of gravity, you do so at your own risk, and inevitably suffer the consequences of the law of gravity if you violate it. That is a physical law of the cosmos, or a physical law of the universe. Well, Aquinas says that just as there are physical laws of the universe, there are moral laws of the universe. Aquinas concluded that the Creator has placed into the physical universe physical laws that if we violate them, such as gravity, we pay a price. And Aquinas also concluded that the Creator has placed into the universe moral laws. If we violate those moral or those ethical laws, we also suffer some inevitable consequences. So to elaborate upon that basic principle of natural law, I've included a number of subpoints there. Aquinas's moral philosophy was based upon Aristotelian ethics, or the ethics of Aristotle. Aristotle was really a very scientifically oriented philosopher. He looked around at nature and he saw that nature had within it certain kinds of physical laws, and that he seems to have concluded that in some fashion, the prime mover of the cosmos has placed into the physical universe some laws that are to be honored. For example, the illustration that is typically used is that if you leave an acorn alone and you plant it under the right circumstances, its destiny is to become an oak tree, and that you're not to trifle with, you're not to fiddle with that destiny. You don't manipulate the destiny. You let the acorn be what it is supposed to be. So you honor the law, physical law of the universe with regard to the acorn becoming an oak tree. So Aristotle also said that there are moral laws in the universe that fall out the same way. Or really, I should say, Aquinas took that and applied it to the moral cosmos. Aristotle emphasized it with regard to the physical universe, emphasized it with regard to human nature, that we as human beings are supposed to be virtuous people, and we're not to trifle with our natural destiny to be virtuous people. So that is to say that Aquinas's natural law ethics was based upon Aristotelian philosophy or Aristotle's ethics. Number two, Aquinas and Aristotle said that the world has purpose built into it. And Aristotle says that the prime mover or the first cause of the universe has placed that purpose into the cosmos or the universe. Aquinas understood that prime mover to be the Christian God. Number three, the purposes things presently serve are what they ought to serve. In other words, an acorn's purpose is to become an oak tree. A pecan's purpose is to become a pecan tree. A dog's purpose is to produce other dogs. And we're not to trifle with that. A human being's purpose is to be a person of virtue, and we're not to trifle with that. That is our destiny that is placed within us from the prime mover, if you're Aristotle, or if you are Aquinas from the Christian God. Then Aquinas moves on to say that the Creator has instilled moral laws into nature itself. So once again, if just as you violate physical laws, you would pay the price. You also, if you violate moral laws of the cosmos, pay a price. And we'll talk more about what those moral laws are. And it all centers around destiny. It all centers around outcome. Um, a human being is born in order to become, or the outcome of which is to become a virtuous person. And so we're to be virtuous people, and we're not to trifle with that process. And then Aristotle concluded, and Aquinas affirmed in his approach, that we can know right and wrong through the use of reason or rationality. That stands in opposition to knowing right or wrong based on religious revelation. Aquinas is highly based upon knowing right and wrong based upon human reason. He has a place for revelation, but revelation only applies to the believer or to the Christian or to the religious person. The religious person only knows things because of revelation. But if you are non-religious, Aquinas still believes you can know the right thing to do simply by the use of your reason, or by the use of your intellect, or by the use of your rationality. So that's a little bit of background with regard to natural law. So with regard to natural law, let me give you an illustration that kind of summarizes what Aquinas was getting at. And this essentially summarizes the Catholic moral philosophy. For example, as human beings, if we have physical relations one with the other, male with female, then the natural outcome of that, which the Creator has put into place, is that there will be conception. There will be the conception of an embryo, the joining of an egg and a sperm. Fertilization will take place, conception will occur, and there will be the emergence of an embryo in the female. So Aquinas says, based on Aristotle's philosophy, that's the natural order of the universe. That's the natural order of human relations. That's the natural purpose for sexuality, that is procreation. And so we are not to trifle with that. So let me give you an illustration of how that might be trifled with, or how it might be interfered with. For example, the Roman Catholic Church, under the teachings of Aquinas, its official position on contraception is that contraception is morally wrong. Why? It's morally wrong because it interferes with the natural processes of nature. It prohibits conception, and the natural consequence of sexual relations between male and female is conception. So therefore, because um, contraception hinders, limits, restricts, makes impossible conception of an embryo, it is an intrusion upon the natural processes of human existence and human relations and is morally wrong. So it interferes with the natural process. Another example, and I don't agree with these examples necessarily. I think it's much more complicated than Aquinas makes it out to be. I don't agree with these examples, but just for the sake of another example, this is why the Roman Catholic Church is anti homosexuality. Because it's not natural, they say, they argue that the natural human relations consist of male and female, not male, male, female, female. Uh, do I agree with that? No, I don't agree with that. But I'm simply trying to communicate to you why the Roman Catholic moral philosophy has reasoned its way into that conclusion. So let's just go back to the conception. The conception gives birth or gives existence to an embryo. Well, then the next natural process of the embryo is for it to mature in the female over a period of 9 months. So it matures in the female over a period of 9 months. And the natural process is for it to become a birthed human being, a baby. As a result of that natural process, because that is a natural process, a natural outcome of physical intercourse, conception, then that leads to birth. Because of that, that's a natural process. To interfere with that natural process is a moral violation. For example, with regard to the issue of abortion, the Roman Catholic position on abortion is morally wrong. Why? They conclude that it's morally wrong based upon natural law. It interferes with the natural processes of embryonic development and hinders the order or the process that the Creator has put into place in the cosmos. So it interferes with nature. That's why it's called natural law. So that's another example. So then let's move on to say that the female gives birth to the child, and the child is born, and the child grows up, and the child commits a crime, a capital crime, and is placed in prison and put on death row and is going to be executed by the state for the capital crime that he or she committed. And so the state passes a verdict of capital punishment on the person. Capital punishment is an interference, according to the Catholic Church, with the natural processes of human life. Human life left alone, you live, you mature, you develop, you become old, and then you die of natural causes. Capital punishment, putting someone to death in any fashion, interferes with that natural process. So therefore, guess what? The Roman Catholic Church would be against capital punishment. Not on any other basis other than that basis. It violates the natural processes of human life. For the same reason, the Catholic Church is against physician-assisted suicide. That occurs when perhaps someone is terminally ill, they're not going to recover, and they decide that they would like for a physician to assist them to end their lives. I think that's legal in some states. I don't know if it's still legal in Oregon. Yeah, I think it used to be legal in Oregon, perhaps Washington State, but Oregon for sure, I do believe. But the Roman Catholic Church would say physician-assisted suicide is wrong because it interferes with the natural processes of growing, maturing, developing, and dying a natural death. In addition, suicide, for example, someone decides to end their life, that would be considered to be morally wrong because it's a violation of the natural processes of life. It's taking nature into one's own hands. So those are examples of natural law theory. Uh, so it's really not that complicated, and yet it is complicated. So what are some objections that we might advance to natural law theory? Well, number one, number one that I placed here is it overestimates the capacity of human reason. It may be excessively optimistic with regard to our ability to reason our way to a valid conclusion regarding what is right or wrong. Uh, so it may be overly optimistic regarding human reason. Some individuals may simply not be able to reason their way to a reliable conclusion regarding what is right or wrong. So it may be excessively optimistic regarding human reason. Number two, natural law rests on a pre-scientific Aristotelian worldview. Uh, Natural law theory is not scientific at all, even though it has scientific implications and scientific bases. There's a difference when you move between addressing the physical laws of the cosmos and the moral laws of the cosmos. Physical laws are somewhat verifiable. Moral laws are much more difficult to verify and much more subject to skepticism. So it's in that sense, it's really based upon a natural law theory is based upon a pre-scientific worldview. Next thing, evolution demonstrates arbitrariness, not purposefulness in nature. Natural law theory says there is purpose in nature, there is design in nature, there is a direction in nature. Sexuality leads to conception. Conception leads to the emergence of an embryo. An embryo leads to the emergence of a fetus. A fetus leads to the emergence of a child. And so the natural processes continue on. However, that is somewhat questionable in that there's also what is called dysteleology in the created order, or disorder in the created order. So natural law theory doesn't really take that into consideration. What about children that are born mentally handicapped? What about children that are born physically handicapped? What about individuals that are injured in their life and maybe have a cognitive disorder? Or something to that effect. So natural law theory seems to be somewhat antiquated when it comes to taking into account the dysteleological aspects of human existence and the created order. And then finally, I've listed another objection for you there on the slide. It fails to appreciate the complicated nature of morality in the scientific era. It fails to appreciate the complicated nature of morality in the scientific era. Science is aimed at confirmation and probability on the basis of the scientific method through the utilization of empirical evidence. Those of you who are majoring in biology or some of the sciences or nursing or some of those kinds of things, you study science and you're familiar with the scientific method and empiricism and empirical data and those kinds of things, and establishing the probability of something occurring once again under the same circuit. Well, that's very different than morality. Morality does not conform to that type of scientific investigation. Morality seems to be much more esoteric and much more nebulous and much more abstract. It's harder to pin down. It's harder to nail down, and it's much more subject. It's much more subject to a questionability than the scientific verification is. There's a difference between scientific verification of physical laws and the verification of moral laws. How do we verify moral laws? How do we verify empirically that something is right or wrong? How do we verify empirically that something is ethical or unethical? That's a big problem. It's hard to do. So the natural law theory fails to take into account the complicated nature of morality and how it does not conform to scientific evaluation or investigation. So natural law theory, if so the next time you're watching television and you hear a news story perhaps that says the Roman Catholic Church is against abortion, or the priest speaking against capital punishment, then you'll understand a little bit more about why the church takes the position that it takes. Now, one positive about natural law theory is this: it is amazingly consistent. It's amazingly consistent down the line. For example, if you ask, let's just say a Baptist religious person, what they thought about abortion, they would say, well, abortion is wrong. If you ask them what they thought about contraception, they would say, well, contraception is permissible. I have no problem with contraception. This is generally speaking. If you ask them what they thought about capital punishment, the taking of a human life, they would say, well, they think that under certain circumstances, probably capital punishment is reliable and is valid as an as a means of punishment for someone who commits a certain level of crime. So they would have no difficulty with capital punishment. Some would say physician-assisted suicide might be permissible if the person is not going to get to improve or progress. But the point of those illustrations with regard to a Baptist would be that morally on those issues, they're really all over the place. Yes to contraception, no to abortion, yes to capital punishment, maybe no to physician assisted suicide. There's really no consistent ethic down the line. But natural law ethics is amazingly consistent down the line. Does it have some variations? Yes, indeed it does, but it's amazingly consistent down the line. And so we kind of have to respect it for that. However, it has a difficult time being applied in the modern scientific era with all of the issues that we're up against, such as stem cell research and in vitro fertilization. In light of the very complicated nature of the moral dilemmas that we're facing, especially in the world of medicine and science, natural law theory seems to be a rather antiquated system. Now, the church wouldn't agree with me on that, but it seems to be rather antiquated. So that's kind of an overview of natural law theory. So another religious perspective is divine command ethics. The divine command ethics is a pretty simple theory and a pretty basic theory. Divine command ethics means exactly what it says. Divine command. Divine command theorists say that we can establish what is right and we can establish what is wrong on the basis purely of what the deity or a group of deities says is right or says is wrong. For example, with regard to let's just take the Ten Commandments, for example. In the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, in the Old Testament, we're given the Ten Commandments: thou shalt not kill, shalt not steal, shalt not bear false witness. Those are divine commands. They're not divine suggestions, according to the religious folks. They're divine commands. We are not to lie, we're not to kill, we're not to steal, we're not to lust, we're not to covet another man's possessions, etc. Those are divine commands. So therefore, because God has commanded those things, uh, because God has commanded those things, it is right to obey them and wrong to disobey them. That's the classic illustration of divine command ethics. Now, this may take its form in a variety of ways with regard to a variety of religions, but this is a highly religious based ethic. The advocate for divine command ethics that I list, and some would disagree with me on this, but it's Soren Kierkegaard. He was a Danish theologian. You don't need to know that name for the exam, but in his book, Fear and Trembling, he elaborates upon divine command theory. The definition for divine command theory says on the slide there that the good thing to do, or the moral thing to do, or the ethical thing to do is whatever God commands. Do what God commands. Don't worry about the consequences. Don't worry about the outcome. Do what God commands. Now, the classic illustration that Kierkegaard uses in his expounding of divine command theory is the Old Testament narrative regarding Abram, uh, who's going to make a sacrifice to God. He's told by God, Jehovah, in the Old Testament to go up into a high mountain and to offer a sacrifice to him. And so Abraham says, well, I will do that, but what will I sacrifice? And the story says, God says that I will provide the sacrifice. So out of obedience to God's divine command, Abram goes up into the mount. I think it's Mount Sinai. It could be Mount Horeb. I can't recall if they're different names for the same place or not. But Abraham goes up into the mountain without a sacrifice, and so when he arrives there, he discovers that he is to sacrifice his son Isaac. And that's a real moral dilemma for Abraham, sacrificing his own son Isaac to God. But God commanded that he sacrifice his own son Isaac as a sacrifice to him. And Abram is more than ready to do so, and is preparing to sacrifice his son to Jehovah God in the Old Testament. When suddenly he hears a rustling in the bushes nearby, and God provides a ram, and God then says, no, don't sacrifice your son. I really was just putting you to the test to see if you would do what I commanded you to do. Now go and sacrifice the ram in the bushes. And so the point of that story is, for Kierkegaard, that Abram was willing to honor and do what God commanded because that was the right thing to do, not thinking about any other the consequences, not thinking about the nature of the command. Just do what God commands God commands you to do. So that's a classic illustration of divine command theory. That's why the designation divine command theory tells you exactly what divine command theory advocates. God commands that which is right. God commands that which is moral. God commands that which is ethical. And God commands that which is immoral or unethical or wrong. So God establishes that. So this theory, without going into the subpoints there on the page, is rather challenging, and it can be excessively subjectivistic. And so in light of that, I've listed on this slide for you some critiques of that. Now, this is not to be, if you are a religious person and you believe in divine command theory, my intention is not to be harsh. My intention is just to point out the strengths and the weaknesses of these theories. So we have to investigate, in the interest of critical thinking, a weakness or a problem of divine command theory. So what is a weakness, or how might we criticize it? Well, the first command that I put there, or the first objection I put there, is what God wills can be arbitrary. Some would say what God wills can be arbitrary. Now, let me elaborate upon that especially. This is true especially in a Platonic dialogue, I should say, a Platonic dialogue entitled Euthyphro. It's a dialogue written by Plato. In that dialogue, this is basically the dilemma that Euthyphro is up against, and that Socrates confronts Euthyphro with. Euthyphro is confronted with making a moral decision, and he decides to make that moral decision. And so then Socrates says to Euthyphro these words: how do you know that that's the right thing to do? How do you know that that's the right thing to do? And Euthyphro responds to Socrates and says, I know that it's the right thing to do because God commands it. And then, to make a long story short and to reduce the dialogue, the conversation proceeds as follows. Socrates counters Euthyphro's statement that God commands it, and so therefore it's right. Socrates counters him by saying, well, is it the right thing to do because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's the right thing to do? That's called the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, I want you to listen to that very closely. Euthyphro says, I know this is the right thing to do because God commands it. And then Socrates says, well, is it the right thing, Or does God command it because it's the right thing to do? Or is it the right thing to do because God commands it? Now, that's an important dilemma if you think about it. Uh, the point being this, and I'm going to try to elaborate on this in a way that it's more easily understandable. But if it's the right thing to do because God commanded it, if it's the right thing to do because God commanded it, then Socrates' point is that therefore God could command anything to be right or wrong. If something is the right thing to do because God commanded it, then God could command anything to be right or wrong. For example, if it's the right thing to do because God commanded it, then therefore God could have simply back there when he was starting things have dictated and commanded that murder was right rather than the preservation of life being right, rather than the Ten Commandments saying thou shalt not kill. God could have just arbitrarily said, okay, well, if I make the rules, here's the rule I'm going to make, thou shalt kill. So if it's the right thing to do because God commands it, that leads to the possibility of God being arbitrary. He can just choose whatever he wants to choose to be right and whatever he wants to choose to be wrong. But then let's take the other horn of the dilemma. The other horn of the dilemma says, or does God command it because it's the right thing to do? If it's the right thing to do, and that's in the universe or in the cosmos, it's just in and of itself the right thing to do. And because it's the right thing to do, then God commands it. Then as a result, God is not acting as God. He's not acting independently of his own will. He's not making the decision. He's not being God. There's some power or some authority that he has to consult outside of himself to find out if it's right or wrong. And then after he finds out if it's right or wrong, he pronounces it to be right or wrong. Now, I think of that in this way. Someone asks God, is it right to kill? Under this horn of the dilemma, God would have to go to a list somewhere in the universe and say, well, let me check that out. So he goes to the list and he looks among all the things that are right and all the things that are wrong. And he finds on that list that killing is wrong. And he comes back and says, oh, I'm going to command that killing is wrong because the source that I consulted says that it's wrong. Well, if that's the case, God's not God. He is less than God. He is subservient to some other authority. So this is a very thorny dilemma. Uh, on the one hand, you have the problem of arbitrariness. If something is right or wrong because God commands it to be so, then that leads to moral arbitrariness. God can decide whatever the hell he wants to be right or wrong, and murder can be right, and preserving of life can be wrong. But on the other hand, if there's some power or authority that God has to consult first, and he doesn't make the final call, then God is not God. He's less than God. He has to consult something that's more dictating and more powerful than him. So that's a real dilemma. That's called the Euthyphro dilemma. And those are the two horns of the dilemma. So that's one issue, one problem with divine command ethics. It's a very thorny issue. Number two, scripture require religious text of any kind require interpretation, and interpretations can vary, and interpretations can be highly subjective, conditioned upon a person's background, circumstance, context in life, era in life. That's one objection. Now, the next objection that I want to bring your attention to is the fourth objection on the slide in front of you, and that is, what if God commands that which is against the social norm? What if God commands that which is against the social norm? Society says this is right. God says this is wrong. Then what do we do? What do we go with? For example, in Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany, society said it was right to arrest Jewish personalities and persons and place them in camps and eventually to take their life. That was the social norm. But then on the other hand, you read in the religious text, thou shalt not uh, murder, or thou shalt, you're to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So then you have to choose. I think most religious folks would go with the would go with the religious document, but nonetheless, there are those dilemmas when the social norm stands in opposition to the divine command. Then the last point that we make there is, how do we assess that perceived command from God as rational as opposed to delusional? There's a thin line there. I mean, there's a point at which that God told me to do something becomes delusional, and so that can become a problem, especially in the area of criminal law and criminal acts and those kinds of things. So divine command ethics is not without its flaw or without its theory, but you should pretty well understand it based upon what I'm talking about. And it may be that you're a religious person and you're committed to divine command ethics, and that's perfectly fine. The only purposes of this lecture at this point is to get you to think about the strengths and the weaknesses of divine command ethics. The strength of divine command ethics is it can be very clear, and it can make moral decision making rather simple. But however, that it can become too simplistic. So, but a strength is it does give us some kind of moral guidance and moral parameters to work within. All right. So the last theory of ethics that I want to look at real quickly is called virtue ethics. These other theories that we've been talking about are theories that address the question of what should we do when we're confronted with a moral dilemma. We ask the question, what should we do? But this theory doesn't ask the question, what should we do? This theory asks the question of what kind of person should I be? The other theories are focused upon doing or acting, but this theory is focused upon being, thus virtues. When we are virtuous people, we're talking about being virtuous in our character, virtuous in our nature, being moral people, nice people, kind people, virtuous people, gracious people, those kinds of things. So the advocate, a contemporary advocate, is Stanley Hauerwas, but the original advocate of virtue theory was Aristotle. Aristotle, in his book, I think it's Eudaimonia, advocated virtue ethics. The definition of virtue ethics is as indicated there on the slide. When confronted by a moral choice, virtue ethics asks us to ask ourselves, what kind of person should I be, rather than what should I do? So when we're confronted with a moral dilemma, maybe cheating in Dr. Carter's exam, or cheating on our spouse, or cheating on our girlfriend, then Aristotle says we should ask ourselves, what kind of person should I be in this moral situation? Not what should I do, but what kind of person do I want to be? And Aristotle says that we are destined to be, we are created in order to be virtuous people. So we need to do the virtuous thing. Uh, so virtue ethics is focused upon virtue, qualities, personal qualities, qualities of character and integrity, and those kinds of things. Aristotle divided the virtues into two sections: the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. The intellectual virtues, we should be intellectually virtuous, Aristotle says, and that means that we have the ability to reason well. We can think our way through. That's what you're about here at Prairie View, or whatever university you're a part of, Houston Community College, or any other university. You're trying to develop intellectual virtues so that you can be more rational, so that you can reason well, so that you can be more logical in your thinking processes. Aristotle says that the intellectual virtues can be learned from teachers. You're not born with intellectual virtues, but you can learn those from your teachers. You can learn those from mentors. You can learn those from parents. You can learn those from professors. You can learn those from the minister. You can learn those from the imam. There are the intellectual virtues. But then Aristotle also emphasized the moral virtues. What are the moral virtues? The moral virtues are described by Aristotle as one possessing the ability to act well, possessing the ability to act well. The interesting thing about the moral virtues is this: it's not taught to us by other people, it's learned through repetition. We learn to do the right thing by doing the right thing. And the more we do the right thing, the more it shapes our being and our character and our virtue. And it helps us increasingly to be more inclined to do the right thing in the future. So those are the two levels of virtues. With regard to the moral virtues, Aristotle would say this: if you do the right thing, then that shapes your character and your being and your nature as a human being. And that results in it being easier for you to do the right thing the next time. So you're sitting in Dr. Carter's exam, you're tempted to cheat on the exam, but you choose not to cheat on the exam, you act well, then that shapes your character, which makes it easier not to cheat the next time. And you can apply that in any moral dilemma. But it's learned, the moral virtues are learned through repetition. The intellectual virtues are learned through exposure to education, exposure to examples, and the teaching of those individuals around us. In light of that, Aristotle, with regard to virtue ethics, advocated what he called the golden means theory. The golden means theory, the word means the average, and I've listed for you there on the slide an example. The virtue of courage, the means, we're to have courage in our lives, Aristotle says. Now, we're not to have a deficit of courage, because Aristotle says that's cowardice. We shrink back. We don't face up to things and take them on. We don't face challenges. We shrink back. But then we're not to have an excess of courage either, because that causes us to do foolhardy things. We would say stupid things in this day and time. It causes us to bite off more than we can chew. Aristotle says when it comes to the virtues, we're to have a balance of the virtues, not too much, not too little, but just the right amount. If we're cowardly, we lack courage. If we are foolishly overly confident, then we have too much courage. And Aristotle has a number of virtues that he lists with regard to the kind of virtuous people we're supposed to be. Objections to virtue ethics: how do we determine which virtues are preferable? Aristotle has a listing of those. I should have put those on the slide. I did not do so, but he has a number of listing. You can Google that and look it up if you want. What are the Aristotelian virtues? But how do we determine which virtues are preferable and which virtues are not so preferable? And then the second question is virtue ethics really a distinctive type of ethical theory, or is it inherent in all of the other theories? But that's virtue ethics. So we've covered those three theories, and it's important that you be familiar with those three theories. Divine command theory, natural law theory, and virtue theory. So have a great day. Bye-bye.